Hi everyone, it's Ian from More Code Consulting. Today we want to talk about encampments, and this is probably not the last conversation we're going to have regarding encampments on this channel, but it's one of the things that people have asked about a lot since the channel was launched. Encampments represent the physical visibility of homelessness in communities large and small in so many countries, especially since the pandemic. It is thought that the rise in encampments may be a result of a failed homelessness response system or an increase in the complexity of people's needs. But really what we're seeing is a mass failures of systems in societies that pretend, or at least claim, to be caring and compassionate about the needs of the most vulnerable members of that society. I've been involved in encampments for a long time. Approximately 25 years ago, as a graduate student, I had a very influential advisor who had me go do a series of qualitative interviews with people living in a very emerging and soon to be large tent city in Toronto. This helped inform a bunch of the work that I was able to do in policy development and responses to encampments when I joined municipal government in the City of Toronto. And for 5 years, I led the City of Toronto's Streets to Homes program, which was a street outreach program that predominantly worked with people in encampments, but also had to liaise with enforcement bodies to make sure that people weren't just moved along or kicked out without having reasonable alternatives of where they could go. And in the past 15 years or so as a consultant, I've worked with dozens of communities throughout Canada, the United States, and other parts of the world on encampments, both large and small. So it's not a new phenomenon for me. The scale might be something we haven't seen before, but the actual existence of encampments is not new. It would seem that the pandemic changed everything, didn't it? Public spaces became people's homes. Income support assistance levels are far too low. Decades of neglect in developing housing has been a significant issue. Eroding mental health and addiction support systems leave people with few alternatives but to live outside, and a shelter system that may or may not have capacity, may or may not have housing focused work happening within the shelters, may or may not be meeting the needs of people, has all contributed to this. Decades ago, as a society, we believed in developing affordable and supportive housing on scale. Under the guise of austerity, we stopped doing that. We used to really try to forecast shelter capacity and make sure that communities had the right volume of shelter for the right number of people. But with all the complexities of siting and operating shelters, many communities resisted ongoing shelter development, and so we ended up in a deficit position. And to be clear, there are some shelters that exist out there that are not aligned to best or promising practices, who believe more in therapeutic incarceration than they do in empowering people towards housing. They're unwilling to meet the needs of people with specific types of issues, and so exclude those types of individuals from coming into shelter, which is leaving some of those people no alternative but to live outside. And I get that you are frustrated with encampments. I get if you're frustrated with encampments if you work in the homelessness response sector, because you're constantly being asked or judged based upon the presence of encampments. And I get it if you live in a neighborhood or you work in a neighborhood and your parks and public spaces are filled with tents, that you can't play baseball or frisbee in the park, or that you're concerned about your kids encountering needles or other trash or debris within public spaces where they play. So we can't be dismissive of the complexity of encampments. But what we can do is think about how we respond differently and get out of a mindset of it being a law and order response and into a mindset of it has to be a housing solution response. The only known cure to homelessness is housing, with supports as necessary. But to be clear, encampments are a housing problem. If we had sufficient housing with the right supports as necessary, we wouldn't have encampments. We really need to focus on two things at the same time, which is like walking and chewing gum. We need to focus on interim solutions to encampments while also focusing on permanent solutions to encampments. And we have to do it at the same time. There are lots of communities right now who are like, we're going to create a pallet shelter community, or we're going to create fields full of tents that are sanctioned encampments that people can live in. And I will say, and then what? Because if you're not also building housing, those things don't end homelessness. Those things just take people who are homeless and take them out of sight. And not too long in the distant future, you're going to have more people than back living in those public spaces. And you're going to think that the system failed. But what you really failed on was ensuring that there was outflow of the system of care. That if all you focus on is people coming into homelessness, without focusing on how people get out of homelessness, the system gets all bottlenecked. Let's talk about sanctioned encampments for a few minutes. Because a number of communities have gone the route of thinking, if we put together a plot of land and we say this is a place that you can sleep, that people will be naturally gravitated towards it and it will be fantastic at resolving what is seen as the organic encampments in parks and other public spaces. So first of all, there's no legal mechanism to force people to use a sanctioned encampment. You may be able to legally prevent people from sleeping elsewhere other than that sanctioned encampment, but let's be honest, communities that have sanctioned encampments still have conflict and issues with people sleeping places other than the sanctioned encampment. Law enforcement can't, for example, pick someone up and force them to go to a sanctioned encampment and say, you must stay here. Sanctioned encampments often have greater scrutiny from a safety perspective and a security perspective and a staffing perspective. Neighbors of sanctioned encampments often say things like, we want there to be security guards, or we want to make sure that there isn't violence or fires. And those may all be reasonable requests. And when we start putting those requests into action, we start creating an environment which may be the very thing that people within the encampment rejected when they said no to shelter. Rules, regulations, requirements that just don't jive with their own personal reality. Sanctioned encampments, in many communities, they're reinventing the wheel, wondering how do we do this? And I will say, the best document I've come across anywhere on the planet that helps me figure out how best to help people live healthier and safer lives if they're going to be living in tents actually comes from UN refugee camp standards. I'm going to put a link in the description below. Look at those standards yourself. How many toilets do you need for every 50 people? How many showers do you need? Fire break separations, etc. Just because a place is sanctioned doesn't always mean it's clean, and I think we need to do better at promoting healthier and safer environments within these sanctioned encampments. If all you do is have an enforcement response to encampment, you're going to create further barriers for the very people you're trying to assist in moving forward with housing. Fines people can't afford to pay, perhaps records that make it more difficult to get a job or show up on a housing rental application in the risk assessment matrix used by the property management company. Moving people along and dislodging them from places over and over again without providing interim or permanent solutions, it just traumatizes people. And it's really expensive. And it's completely ineffective. If you're going to have a response to encampments in your community, better to have an appointed leader that is approved by a broad range of interested and affected parties who can also bring together a broad range of interested and affected parties. This leader needs to be empowered to make decisions relative to operations and responses to encampments, who can, for example, have different entities like police and public health and fire and paramedics and social workers do health and safety assessments within encampments and come back with recommendations on how those can be reduced, mitigated, or in serious situations may result in having to close the encampment because of high risk of injury or loss of life. A leader that can operate within the legal framework and dynamics that exist within your jurisdiction. A leader that is focused on solutions and activating them. And a leader that knows the value in engaging people living in encampments and solutions that affect them. Nothing about us without us is what people in encampments would say over and over and over again. The leader needs to be able to ensure that we are looking at both interim and permanent solutions. And so to that end, there are two types of assessments that we really want co-occurring within encampments. The first is the broader encampment assessment, which is often health and safety, as I was just speaking to, as well as the assessment at the individual level. What is the strengths and needs of this person? What is the strengths and needs of that person? What are the strengths and needs of this person? What are the strengths and needs of that person? Individualized service plans. No two people are the same. We shouldn't have expectations of exiting from encampments exactly the same. Encampments are always a response to shelter. Now that doesn't mean shelters are bad. Sometimes people tried to get into shelter, there was no space, or sometimes people wanted to go to shelter, but they were really far away and had no way of getting from point A to point B. And sometimes people heard reputations of shelters and decided they're not going to go, and other people have tried certain shelters and it just wasn't for them. So where do we go in our response to encampments? We need to leverage the voice of people with lived experience and have a dedicated leader or champion. And working together, we need a plan. A plan both in the interim and permanent across an entire community, not just at a specific encampment level, of what is our encampment response. What are the values and principles, the things that we hold in common that we believe that will inform our response? What are the resources and the interested parties and how those resources and parties are going to work together to actually impact positively the lives of people in encampments, both on an interim basis and a permanent basis. And we need to act with urgency, but not with haste. We need to understand if there are health and safety concerns and work to address those, either by responding within the encampment and making it healthier and safer, or in those very rare instances where legal authority exists to say we need an alternative location, or we need to recognize that this current environment is actually going to result in injury, loss of life, or there are already people being harmed within this encampment. I've had the opportunity to be at, probably at this point in my career, well over 100 encampments. They're not all the same. Some are beautiful communities where people are collaborating together for a better existence, helping one another out. And others are places of exploitation and crime. I've encountered, for example, large-scale human trafficking in encampments, large-scale drug manufacturing in encampments. Is that the norm? No, but does it happen? Yeah. Let's not pretend that all encampments are beautiful places with people experiencing kumbaya on a daily basis. It's not. That's the reality. We can do better, folks. Thanks for watching.